Welcome to the Successful Athletes Podcast, where we interview successful athletes to make you a faster cyclist. It's presented by TrainerRoad, and I'm Coach Jonathan Lee, and joined with me here today is Will Stinger, based out of Idaho. Is that correct?
Yes.
Cool. Thanks for joining us, Will. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
You actually reached out to me, and I really appreciate that. And anybody that wants to be on this podcast, if you use TrainerRoad to accomplish anything, it doesn't have to be a big race win. It could be a national championship. It could be something that you just feel like you have made significant improvement, significant to you. Let me know. Just go over to trainerroad.com/podcast. And then there's a form that you can fill out there, and you can go to the Successful Athletes Podcast, fill out the form, and let me know. And it would be awesome. So then we can get some more great folks just like you that are listening to this on the podcast. So first things first, Will, why don't you give us a little bit of background? What do you do for work? What's your family situation like? And where exactly are you based out of in Idaho?
I am an OBGYN, so deliver babies for a living. Lives fairly irregular schedule. I'm married with 4 kids, ages 11, 10, 8, and 5. And most of my time until just a few weeks ago was in Pocatello, Idaho, and recently moved to Middleton, Idaho.
Which is just outside of Boise, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Man, 11, 10, 8, and 5 for the kids?
Yeah.
That 11, 10, and 8, that must have been really tough. Like just that tight spread is, I want to first talk about that very thing, training with kids. So we'll talk about your history and everything else, but just first things first, I'm sure a parent's listening to this that's probably struggling with training with kids. When do you fit in your training?
The vast majority is early mornings before it's time to get them ready for school. So typically up riding 5 or 5:30.
Got it. And so I guess that's just depending on the workout. You'll get up a little bit earlier and do that sort of thing. How do you fuel your work to make sure that the workouts are feasible and doable like that?
Well, initially I wasn't. I just get up, get on the trainer with a bottle of water, and because I, mostly roll out of bed 10 minutes before it's time to start riding. And it was actually, a little over a year and a half ago, caught one of the podcasts. I was using TrainerRoad for almost a year before I discovered there was a podcast associated with it. And
that's my bad as a marketer.
when I found the podcast, one of the first episodes I heard was Amber talking about fueling work. And that was a bit of an epiphany for me. And I started at least trying to get something in. And so some mornings I do the piece of toast, but mostly I've always done well with liquid calories. I found out a while back racing, I did better with that. So I use Infinite Nutrition and one of their custom blends. I have a couple different blends I use depending on what I'm doing. And I just try to get up, mix a bottle of that, and start drinking it as I got the trainer ready, things like that, and then just drink it as I rode.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a big point that I see a lot of people ask is, well, how do I get the food in before that workout? But the point is, if you're taking in fuel as you're training, you're accomplishing the goal, right? You're getting it done. So that's a smart way to do it.
Yeah, that was enough for me. Every now and then, depending on the workout, I'd even get out of bed, do it like a Martin gel real quick, and then start the Infinite, something like that.
Yeah, no doubt. So we're going to talk today about your improvement, but also specifically we're going to talk about Lotoja. So for those that don't know what Lotoja is, can you explain what that race is? Because that's really kind of be like the crux of, or the guiding backbone of our conversation.
So Lotoja is, I hope this is still true, but they market it as the longest one-day USAC sanctioned race in America. It starts in Logan, Utah, and then goes through Utah into Idaho, back out of Idaho into Wyoming, and ends in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
How long is it?
So it ends up about 202 miles. There were some course changes this year and little things that made it about 204 this year.
So that's like 327 kilometers for people. Like 325 would be your 202. So that's a ton. That's a huge distance. What's the course profile like with a race that long? Because that sounds like, Idaho, Wyoming, all that, and Utah, those are all really mountainous states.
Yeah, the course profile is pretty interesting, and that plays a big role in how the race goes down as well. But so you leave Logan, the first 30 miles are pretty flat, and you ride into Preston, Idaho, just through just kind of flat farm ground, and then you start a fairly long climb that the main portion of the climb takes about an hour. With the real work is about 30 minutes, and has a false summit in it that gets a few people here and there, and then you think you're to the end, and you still really have another mile to go, and then drop downhill into Montpelier, Idaho. From there, you hit another climb right away. After then, you have your first aid station in Montpelier. Have a climb called Geneva Summit that takes about 7 to 10 minutes, depending on the pace of the group you're with, but hits fairly hard right there. And drop back into Wyoming, and you kind of have another flat spot for a while. And right around 100 miles in, you have what they call the KOM section, and that's a 2.5 mile climb that takes 10 to 12 minutes. Again, kind of depending on the pace. And so you have those 3 big climbs all in the first 100 miles. And then the next part is you just kind of go fairly flat for almost the next 100 miles, slowly fading downhill for a little bit, and then slowly gaining a little elevation as you finish into Jackson, with one small little climb with about 12 miles to go.
So it's you start out with the climbing in the first half-ish of the race, and it's still substantial. I mean, you gain around 9,000 feet of climbing or 9,000 feet of elevation over the course of the race, with 3 really marked climbs that you end up dealing with. So it's pretty tough, because a lot of the time I would assume that it's easy to blow yourself up on those climbs. Then you just have that long dragging section coming in for 100 miles that if you've blown yourself up, it would be terrible.
Yeah, that's the big key to this, is that if you want to make the lead group, you have to make the selections over those 3 climbs, and which is tough then, because then you've got 100 miles to go.
Yeah, no doubt. So let's rewind, and I'm thinking like all the way back in 2015 is when you first started cycling, correct? And you actually started with a mountain bike, but then quickly transferred to road riding.
Yes, sort of. I had a mountain bike about a year before I bought my first road bike. So I got my first mountain bike in August of 2015. I'd been in medical school and residency for 8 years, and hadn't done a lot of physical activity. I was a fairly active person, but I never no dedicated training of any kind. And I had wanted to get in better shape for ski season, was the biggest thing. I thought, well, I kind of gave up the last 8 years. I need to get fit again. I tried running a little bit. I found out I hated that just as much as I always had, and hurt my knees and ankles. So I got first mountain bike and started searching for trackers, and I found Strava, and rode a couple times without realizing, hadn't hit any actual segments. And then the first time that I came down this kind of fun downhill segment, but right by my house, and I was like number 110 of 120 or something like that. And I came home to my wife. I was like, "Wait, look at this! It like shows you like how you rank compared to everybody else." And there were names on there I knew. And I said to her, "This is gonna end in tears, but I'm moving to the top of that list." And that started a bit of a sickness right there. And went from the mountain bike racing, and then in early 2016, I decided I want to start racing. So I did a couple races, and then was finding days it was either raining or cold or some reason I couldn't get on the mountain bike. So I thought, well, I'm going to get a road bike just to train. And at that point, my only motivation was just to train for the mountain biking. And it turned out I actually really enjoyed riding the road bike. And so did my first road race, and then about 8 months after buying the road bike. So I think that was April of 2017 was my first ever road race.
And you got dead last in that race, right?
I got dead last.
What sort of race was it?
It had two 16-mile loops, pretty close to my house. Had a fairly flat, but it had a couple little climbs that are pretty sharp, just hit hard for about 2 minutes. And, we were 2 miles into this race and my heart rate was at 160, which for me is pretty close to threshold. And I thought, I can't believe how hard we're going already. This is totally different than mountain biking. And I held on for the first lap, just barely. And at the start of the second lap, we hit a climb, everybody surged and I just fell right off the back. And there were a couple other guys back there with me that fell off, and they eventually just rode away from me. And I rode in about 5 minutes behind the lead group. So I think total distance was about 34 miles. So it wasn't a long race. We were on the bike about an hour and a half. And that was a really eye-opening that there was a completely different level of fitness that I thought, well, I'm riding as a Cat 5 rider. I'm in the bottom, and I'm the bottom of the bottom here.
Looking back at that race, what did you do wrong that you would tell yourself now?
I think a couple of things that I did learn. Again, one of the things listening to Amber, cognitive load. I was pretty nervous, just trying to hang on, trying to figure out where I was supposed to be, trying not to crash wheel, things like that. That was I was putting a ton of effort into that, I think. And then I just didn't have the fitness. I mean, I thought of myself as a climber. I'm fairly light and had always climbed well on a mountain bike. That's where I'd made up my time. And yet this little 2-minute climb, everybody jumped on it and just rode away from me.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it had to do a lot with the unfamiliarity of pack riding as well? I see that with a lot of folks that are good climbers, but like naturally just speaking, but when they get into the environment where they have to ride efficiently leading up to the climb and they don't have those skills yet, it makes those climbs extra decisive, so to speak.
Yeah, that's what I felt like, is that I had used up every bit of energy just trying to hang on the back of the group. So then when they surged, there was nothing left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt. So at that point, you did that race. That's in April 2017, and then that same year you decided to ride Lotoja. And to be clear, Lotoja has like they call it the cyclist sportive category, which is effectively like a less competitive one, more non-competitive, more riding for completion. Is that correct?
Yes, they kind of have the licensed race category that then is broken down by category, age groups, things like that. And then they have the cyclist sportive, which is essentially just kind of male and female and some loose age groups. And that one, most guys are and girls just trying to finish, just trying to figure out, can you ride your bike for 200 miles?
Yeah, what the heck made you think that you wanted to take that on? That is so ambitious. Like I had a similar experience of taking on something that way too big. Like I bit off way more than I could chew in my first year of cycling, but I definitely didn't do a 200-mile race. That must have taken a lot of courage. Like, were you scared or nervous about it? And what made you do it?
I was nervous, not necessarily scared. I think that just part of personality, things like that. When I first bought my road bike, in August 2016, somebody said, "Oh, are you going to ride Lotoja?" I said, "Well, what's that?" Like, well, it's a 200-mile race. And I said, "Oh, well, when is it?" Sure, it sounds cool. So it's just, immediately I was like, "Yeah, I'd like to do that." And they're like, "Oh, wait, you have to register like way in advance. There's only a 1-week registration period. You missed it clear back in April." And I was like, "Oh, well, I'm going to do it next year." And so started researching it, reading about it, searching internet things. And when the registration opened, I found out that a lot of people don't get in. And so they were saying one of the guaranteed ways of getting in is to register for what's called the Huntsman Hometown Heroes. And you raise $1,000 for cancer research, and that guarantees you getting in. And so I wanted to make sure I got in, because I knew I didn't want to put in the work for this and not get in. So I registered for that back in, I think it was January or February, which allows you to kind of get in early before the real registration comes in. And so then I raised that $1,000 for cancer research to guarantee that I got my spot in Lotoja.
Nice. So let's talk about how did your day go? And we'll probably not get into too many details here, but how did your day go? And then what did you learn from the experience overall, from doing your first 200-mile ride in the first year that you started riding?
Overall, it went pretty well. I definitely learned that it was really hard to sit on your bike for that long. So, most of my issues came from finding out that after a little over 100 miles, I had this terrible pain in my foot. My shoes didn't fit quite right. And, then finding out that my saddle was just driving me crazy after being on the bike that long. But everything else otherwise went pretty well. My wife acted as a support crew for me. She did a good job. I didn't spend any time really in aid stations that I didn't need to, other than at one of the very last ones, I finally took my shoe off and walked around for a little bit just to try to stretch out my right foot, because it was hurting so bad that it was distracting me from pedaling.
Yeah, no doubt. How did you end up fixing that? Was it just new shoes? Was it insoles? What was the specific thing?
Just new shoes, new different shoes. I had gotten those shoes for super cheap when I first started road riding. Local shop had them in. I found out they were meant to be for a wide foot, and I definitely don't have a wide foot, and just fit issues there.
I can see somebody listening to this that probably has foot issues and are wondering what you went for. So what shoes did you end up getting?
I got Giro Empires. I think that's what they are. They're the lace up Giros. And
those are
I like.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I like the laces a little better because you could kind of customize all the pressure points across the top of the foot a little better, and seem to be able to dial in to fit better. And that fixed my problem.
Awesome. Those are known for having a more narrow last as well, so they're good for narrower feet. So yeah, it's a solid pick. So thereafter, after Lotoja, you found TrainerRoad in February of 2018, and that's when February and March. That's when you really started getting starting with training. So tell us about that whole process. What made you go from completing the cyclo sportif side of things and then going, I want to follow a structured training plan?
It was mostly finding out that a lot of these guys that I was racing against in these road races, I'm looking at their Strava profiles, stalking them, and finding out they've been riding all winter. And, in Pocatello, Idaho, we're at 5,000 feet. The first road race I did was in April. And at that point, I'd only even been able to ride for about 4 weeks outside. And I didn't want to go through that again. And so finally got the trainer in February of 2018, so I could start a little earlier on getting some of those miles in and being able to have fitness for earlier races.
Yeah. And in that process, you started following, I think that the first time you followed sweet spot base mid volume, you followed sustained power build and century plan, which is the ideal setup, I would say, for Lotoja. Because it's such a long day, the century plan really works on those sustained sort of efforts. But what was it like to go from just riding to training? What things did you bump up against that were difficult?
Overall, I had a great experience with it. So as far as difficulties go, it's just finding the time every day, making sure, and that wasn't super hard for me. I like being on a fairly strict regimen, so I was just getting out of bed same time every morning, getting on the trainer. Here and there, I'd get called into work earlier than I thought I would need to, and so I'd have to leave a ride halfway through, things like that. So I didn't always get to finish my plan. Every now and then, that was probably the biggest thing I ran into, was just work issues.
How did you schedule around that? Because for some of us, that can drive us nuts, right? And it's funny how a small derailment can actually cause a much larger effect down the road, and we end up really falling off the wagon. And usually it's just because of us getting disappointed. Was that a temptation at all for you to become discouraged with it all, or how did you manage that?
And I don't think I ever hit the point I felt discouraged on anything. I would just run into periods where it would seem like I'd have a few bad days in a row at work. And so I'd probably, if anything, just start getting a little grumpy that I hadn't been able to ride for a few days. And I always did my plans. So I rode Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday off, and then rode Friday, Saturday. Kind of how I always scheduled the mid-volume stuff. And I typically even always added in a filler workout on Thursdays, just depending on how things went. But my most common day for being on call was Thursday, and that would start at 7 a.m. So I could get a ride in before 7 a.m., but then that meant that until 7 a.m. Friday, I was kind of on the hook. Mm-hmm. And so some nights, if I got totally blown up at work all night and I'd spend the whole night in the hospital, then I wouldn't get up and do that Friday ride. And sometimes that lack of sleep Thursday into Friday would still make Saturday's rides feel tougher than I felt like they should have, compared to when I would get good sleep.
I can imagine. How did you adjust the workouts in those cases? Was it, if you felt too tired, did you skip the workout, or did you just turn down the intensity or manage it some other way?
It really depends, but I did both at various times. Either one. I just tried to be flexible with making sure that I wasn't overcooking myself. And when I first started, I probably was not flexible enough, and I'd be, I got to do this, I'm going to do it. And I'd force myself through the workout on then Friday morning and Saturday, and find that then still on Monday, I was struggling with the workouts. And as I learned more, listened to the podcast, then starting in 2019, and some of the things I learned from that, I started to prioritize that recovery just as much as the riding, and wasn't then as afraid to miss those workouts here and there on Friday morning, or to dial back that intensity and just change the type of workout that day and just do some endurance work rather than trying to hit VO2 max, something like that.
Mm. Yeah, that's like the hardest part, I think, for a lot of us type A athletes is viewing modifications as a way forward rather than a step back. But it's something that we all have to do, and we kind of learn ourselves and learn our bodies and learn what we need as time goes on. What was your starting point in terms of power to weight when you first started with TrainerRoad?
With TrainerRoad, I don't know exactly where my weight was at that point, but it was probably just a little bit heavier. My first ever test was 192 watts. And so that would have been somewhere around 2.8 to 3 watts per kilogram, depending on what my weight was at that point. And I'm not sure where I was at that point.
Yeah. And how tall are you, to give people a point of reference?
5'10", or about 178 centimeters.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks for doing the conversion for me. Yeah. And so you have a slight frame as an athlete, then I would assume, being able to, at that height, still maintain this lower weight that you have.
I do. Yeah. I've always been pretty thin, but I actually dropped around 20 pounds when I very first started riding. I'd come out of ski season around 160 pounds. And the first year that I started riding a bunch, I dropped right down to about 140 to 145, just depending. I bounced around in there.
Wow. Yeah. And that's just the increased activity. How did you manage the nutrition side of things? Because also, I assume with your work, it would probably be tough to it's not like you have a very established lunch break, I assume, and very established dinner, and it's always consistent. So what do you do for your nutrition to fuel your training and also just in everyday life?
Overall, eat fairly healthy. I try not to be super restrictive because then I feel like it does lead to cravings. But I just tried to make sure I was getting plenty. I'd find I'd get in cycles of under fueling or not eating enough at breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So then I'm wanting to snack later, and but then I'm not as hungry, so I don't eat as much of the good food when it's there, and get into that cycle. So I tried to make sure that I was really doing a lot better about really getting a good breakfast and a good lunch, good dinner, and so then any snacks in between were healthy. Um, I read the Endurance Diet by Matt Fitzgerald, and overall, really, it's easy to like a book when you agree with it, but overall, I didn't find anything in there that I didn't think was already good advice.
Yeah. And so that means that you probably eat a carb-centric diet that to fuel work that has a lot of variety in it, right? I assume.
Ton of variety within reason. My breakfast is kind of the same every day. I do a bowl of dry rolled oats with honey and almonds and milk over the top of it. That sometimes I add fruit, depending on what we have around, or chopped dates, things like that. So my breakfast doesn't always have a lot of variety. It's almost always the same, but a bunch of carbs right there. Lunches, a lot of times whole wheat sandwiches, whole wheat with chicken breast, things like that, and then lots of beets and carrots. And then dinners, a lot of chicken and rice, chicken and sweet potatoes with peas or broccoli, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it's the sort of stuff that helps for sure. Is there any, did you learn anything nutrition wise at all that helped your training progress better? Maybe helped you improve more? Was there any like key thing that you latched onto?
Biggest things were really just increasing that percentage of carbs. I shifted how the portion size on my plate of how much chicken and how much rice. That pile of chicken got smaller, the pile of rice got bigger. Same thing, 2 sweet potatoes and a little piece of chicken instead of a big piece of chicken and 1 sweet potato. That was a major thing for me, was just a lot more carbs.
Mm. And at this point, so you've trained through 2018, and at that point, you're following a structured training plan with the goal of doing Lotoja again. But you had a pretty severe crash just the week before.
I did. 2018, September 1st, what was going to be my last training ride before Lotoja, other than just kind of tapering in, a few easy rides. Riding in the dark. That's what you do when you get up at 5 a.m. to do a lot of workouts, and hit a cattle guard, got a center gap on a cattle guard, and brought to an almost immediate stop. My face hit the carbon wheel, and it broke out a bunch of teeth, cut my lips and tongue up pretty bad, and I spent that first night in the ICU.
Wow. That's terrible. Holy cow. That's like my worst fear realized right there with the cattle guard. I'm always so afraid of going over those. So this was just a lack of, I assume that because it was dark and everything else, you just didn't see the gap in the cattle guard there.
Yeah. It's cattle guard I'd ridden over, I don't know, 100 times probably before. And due to just a couple life things that morning, and the Pocatello Marathon was going on that morning, and I changed my route a little bit because I ran into them, and I didn't want to be scaring riders by coming from behind, or scaring runners by coming from behind them. So I went the opposite way around the loop in that morning. Just a couple little things added up that, even though I've been over this cattle guard a bunch of times, I managed to just hit that center gap. I had lights on, but just wasn't quite enough to realize what I was doing that early in the morning.
Oh, man. So how long was that recovery? You mentioned that, facial damage and dental and everything else. Those are pretty long recoveries, right?
The biggest thing was I lost a lot of blood. And so I was able to, about a week afterward, or even the day after I got out of the hospital, I sat on the trainer and pedaled for what was basically 1 mile of riding. And that was just exhausting. But I just had to kind of prove to myself that other than my face, there really wasn't any damage. I had a little bit of road rash here and there, but I really got lucky that legs, arms, everything else were all totally okay. But I'd lost a lot of blood. And so as soon as I'd start even spinning the pedals, my heart rate was at max.
Wow.
And it took a few months before that really started getting back to normal. It takes a long time to build new red blood cells. And that I definitely felt the effects of that. I helped coach our local NICA team, and I'd gone to a couple of the races and tried just riding the course in pre-rides with the kids, and would find I couldn't even do much riding at all without heart rate being way up there.
Was that frustrating at all for you? Or I don't know if because you're in the medical field, you kind of anticipated a longer tail or a longer recovery for this, but many athletes would be really frustrated with that, with the delayed recovery, perhaps, because the rest of your body's fine, right? But
yeah, I had a hard time with it for a while because, one, I was just pretty down about, essentially I put all my work for the year into this one race, and then I crashed a week before. And so I was pretty down on that. And so that part was hard because it was going to be my first year racing it. I had done the Cyclosport of the year before, but I was entered in a Cat 4-5 Masters group, a 35 plus age group, Cat 4-5. And so I wanted to see how it was different racing it. And so just with that not happening, I was a little down, but I was motivated to get back on the bike. And it may have been a blessing in disguise that I found myself extra motivated, but I had to take it pretty easy. I eased back into it. I feel like I was pretty smart with how I went about it. And I waited until I could tell for sure that heart rate seemed to be normal for the amount of power that I was putting out, and just gradually worked back into it. And somewhere around middle of November, I started noticing that things were going better. I did a cyclocross race somewhere in there, and definitely wasn't back to normal, but was close enough that I felt like I could start training again. And so around December 1st, I really started trying to build some base again. And then I went back onto a training plan on January 1st. So about 5 months later.
Wow. So that's some good perspective for other people that are maybe dealing with something like this. It takes time, but it takes the time it needs, and patience is really the best way forward with it. So when you started training in 2019, you mentioned that you used Plan Builder to build out your plan that year, right? For Lotoja.
I think that was still pre-Plan Builder.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yep.
January 2019. I went to the kind of same thing again. I did the Sweet Spot base, mid volume, and then the Sustained Power build and Century plan. And after the crash, then that completely changed my indoor training. That before I was still riding outdoor a lot without a lot of structure, and was just using TrainerRoad in between here and there, and had been if it was raining, I'd get on the trainer and do TrainerRoad stuff, or it was cold or different things. And I tried to get in a couple workouts a week. But then 2019, that crash made it a lot harder for me to convince myself to go ride in the dark like I had been in the years before. And so I was dedicated to getting on the bike every morning on the trainer. and it made my wife a lot happier. She was pretty shaken up by me having a crash in the dark. And so she was a lot happier if I was on the trainer. And so then I was really dedicated to just sticking with that structure, and spent a lot of weeks just, getting all those 5 rides every week on the trainer.
When I look at your career, that marking year of 2019, like your training stress is really consistent, and it's consistent, and you see a whole lot more indoor training from that too. And that's a lot of the time we have this tendency to try to find like the huge week is exactly what we need to be able to propel ourselves ahead, or a different type of training that's totally different from what we're doing. But consistency is key. That's the biggest determinant of improvement that we see with people. When they're more consistent, they improve more. And it seems really logical when you say it that way, but it's something that many times we overlook, the importance of, just like you said, hitting those 5 workouts every single week and just layering that for months. So with that buildup that you have for 2019 going into Lotoja, what was your plan going into Lotoja? You had completed it once, you had the really bad crash, so you missed out on another opportunity, but what was your plan this time?
So this time I entered that same Cat 4-5 Masters group again. And I just, by that point, then I'd also discovered the podcast. So I spent all of 2019, I had finally learning racing tactics for the first time, which was completely foreign to me. There was a podcast where I remember it was you saying how different it was to be able to race a race and just try to be hanging on for dear life versus race and being the one to dictate, and how much more fun it was. And I can remember as I'm hearing this January, February 2019, thinking, oh man, how would that be? Like every road race I've done, I've just been hanging on for dear life. Then I went into early 2019. I had a couple of shorter road races where I actually felt like I was able to respond to everything. I was just out there having fun. And it was completely different. I had a completely different experience with road racing in 2019 than I had previously. And so I gave a ton of credit to being able to train through the winter, being able to be consistent and just following those workouts. And I had a little panic attack about 6 weeks before Lotoja of whether or not TrainerRoad was the right thing. I was like, oh, did I do the right thing? I haven't done a bunch of big rides. I was seeing friends post centuries every week that I knew were also going to be racing Lotoja, where I, for the most part, was all 2 hours or less, just following the training plan. And I'd had a couple of longer rides, 4 or 5 hours, just so I knew I could sit on my bike that long, just so I knew my shoes weren't hurting my feet. But that was definitely not a staple of my training. That my training was all just hitting the workouts in TrainerRoad. And so I had a little bit of a panic for a while, but I thought, well, I just got to believe in this. And I went to 2019's Lotoja, ended up with a great start group, a great bunch of guys. I was racing solo. I've never had a team there in Pocatello. Had a great race, comfortably rode through all 3 of those major selection points, which are, the 3 big climbs, and was in the lead group. There were 10 of us in that lead group that went over the top of that last climb together. So then I knew now all I have to do is just hang on, just be able to do my share of work in the pack now. And here's the 10 guys that are going to go on and hopefully sprint it out for a win 100 miles later.
Yeah. And then, so leading up into that, we're getting to the point where we're through the climbs. What happened?
About 25 miles later, I got a flat tire. And flatted out of the lead group. And luckily the wheel car was close. I had checked some wheels. I got a spare wheel, but I was never able to chase back to that lead group. And I spent the next 75 miles just convinced that somebody from my group was going to catch me from behind. And at some points I kept praying they would, so I had somebody else that I could ride with, because you're not supposed to ride and work together with people that aren't in your start group. You have to stay kind of with your category. And so it was a pretty lonely finish into the line. And I came across the line just devastated, and, said to my wife, I thought, wow, I think I could have got a top 10 if I hadn't flatted. And she kind of looked at me, she said, well, you were 10th. And I was like, oh. So I hadn't done the math on how many were in that lead group. In my head, there were more than that. And so she's like, yeah, there were 9 of them came across the line, and then nobody else has come, and you came in, so you were 10th. So that seemed to be a small consolation prize to me to be able to say to myself that I was 10th.
That's pretty awesome. Way to go. So a year of structured, diligent training, consistency, making sure that you were gaining all of these insights from the podcast as well about efficient riding in a group and how to work within a race and race tactics, and you get top 10. That's awesome. So let's go another year, because that's what you did. Going into the following year, what was your plan then, and what did you do differently this last year?
So this last year, I had an entry to Leadville. Ooh. So I had kind of thought Lotoja was going to be on the back burner. I was kind of putting all my eggs in the Leadville basket. But again, so now I used Plan Builder. I built out a plan that had the Tahoe Trail 100 as a B race, and then Leadville as my A race, and Lotoja as another B race. And Lotoja was supposed to be 4 weeks after Leadville. And so I thought it'd be just enough time to maybe be able to recover for a couple of weeks, get back on my bike, do a little riding for a couple of weeks, and then cruise into Lotoja. And then, the pandemic happened, and races were canceled. And so Tahoe Trail didn't happen. Lotoja didn't happen, Leadville didn't happen. And so as each of those were canceled, then I altered Plan Builder and shifted everything to Lotoja being that A race for me.
Was that hard at all to shift those gears? I mean, interestingly, it's really similar in terms of training demands that you would have for Leadville and something like Lotoja, just because they're such long days. And they actually kind of end up being really similar or close to similar in time too. But was that difficult at all to change that from a motivation perspective?
Yeah, time-wise, I thought they were going to line up identical. I knew, nutrition strategy would be almost identical. I was hoping to go around 8.5 hours at Leadville. So I knew 8.5 to 9 hours. So I knew that time on the bike was going to be almost identical to a Lotoja effort. And so all of that lined up good. But each time one of those races got canceled, it was a little harder there was this little question on motivation, but I was able to just get back on the bike. I thought, well, okay, I guess I've still got Lotoja, and I was just hoping it didn't get canceled. And so I shifted. I used Plan Builder, and it gave me extra build time actually then. If I remember right, the specialty still ended up the same, but by taking out those other races, it recalculated and gave me a little bit of extra build time leading up to that specialty phase. And so actually I gained a few weeks of training.
Yeah. What was, you reached the fittest you've been at this point too, this year, I believe, just looking at your career too. Yeah. What's been your high mark for the FTP this year, and weight with that as well?
So high mark, I hit a ramp test of 256. Nice. After one of that final build phase, which at that point put me at 4.1 watts per kilo.
Awesome. Cracked the 4 barrier. That's a tough one to crack.
Yeah.
Did you do anything differently this year with your training, in particular in regards to actual execution, maybe nutrition, timing, or anything else?
I think the biggest things was even more than ever, those things we talked about of focusing on the recovery, and then making sure that I was getting those carbs. I more clean carbs than ever before, and just really fueled the work. I sort of gamed the system on those ramp tests that, almost every other morning I just get up, get right on the bike. And for my ramp tests, I would almost always get up, I'd eat breakfast, I'd do the ramp test 2 hours later. And more like how I wanted to see where that best case scenario was. And so I would do the breakfast 2 to 3 hours before, make sure I was well hydrated, do the ramp test. And it did make the workouts then a little harder because I was coming in, a little fasted, underhydrated. But by getting on the bike and starting to use the Infinite Nutrition and drinking that down as I rode, I still was able to get through the workouts in general at that higher FTP.
Awesome. Yeah. And sometimes, and for everybody, they kind of react differently to testing protocols and everything else like that. Within reason, we designed the ramp test to have the highest bandwidth we have ever been able to see from a testing perspective, right? In the sense that it includes, it's the largest midsection there. It really is the best solution for most. And in that case, though, it's really a good observation that you had to anticipate that the workouts would be harder, but if they're still manageable, that means that you're getting more out of your training, right? And if you're focusing on the recovery, it's another key point. When I look at your career for this past season, I see equal consistency to previous years, but one marked thing that I see is much more training stress coming from indoor workouts themselves, rather than coming from the mix of outdoor and indoor as well. So, and that's one thing that I've noticed is I try to be strict with myself on training versus riding. And I'd never try to call riding training, right? Like when I'm just riding outside, but really just the stress part, making sure that I'm really hitting my marks with my workout. So you did an incredible job with that. Way to go.
Yeah, that was definitely a change there. Even with last year when I felt like I put a ton of trainer time in, this 2020 season was partially different because there wasn't, weekly group rides were a little different. They weren't there. We'd had a weekly hill climb series in Pocatello. It wasn't weekly. Every couple weeks there'd be a hill climb, and so I'd find myself tapering then a week the night before just so I was ready. And so my Tuesday ride wasn't always quite as hard as it should have been, so that I was ready for the hill climb on Wednesday. And little things like that I probably was cheating myself before, but then those things just didn't happen this year. So I was just hitting those marks every time on the trainer.
I think it's been the unanticipated favorable consequence of all of this that we've gone through this year is at least we've gotten more consistent training, right? Yeah. So let's go into Lotoja this year. Your races have been canceled. This is your big one. You've prepared for it. How did the race go?
It went really well overall. So there were one of the biggest changes I do have to at least bring up here is I actually raced with a team for the first time. There's a team that had consistently been beating me up in road races for the last couple of years. So I had raced in the Utah Cycling Association series, and it was Zone 5 racing, and I had gotten to know them. I'd gotten some really good guidance from one of the guys there on Lotoja stuff over the past couple of years. And so I wanted to build a race with those guys. And so the year, as we kind of started out early 2020, I was able to join that team, go to their team camp, do a few things. And so then as they were deciding who was racing what categories, I requested a Cat 4 upgrade so that I could race the Cat 3-4 group this year. Because a couple of those guys I wanted to build a race with were Cat 3s. And we had a group of guys, that sort of 6 of us then, that ended up deciding to race that Cat 3-4 group. And so I knew it was going to be a little harder than the 4-5 group that I'd raced before. And it was an open where I had raced the Masters group before, a 35 plus group. This was just an open 3-4. So we've got all ages. I knew it would go a little harder. And so I almost thought for sure I was giving up any podium chances by joining this category. But I really wanted to race with these guys. So that was kind of some of the build up to it. Changed categories, got a team, and then there were some adjustments to Lotoja this year because of COVID. They changed some of the aid station strategies. So we kind of did it with one less aid station than usual. In the past, they had done bottle hand-ups in a couple places, and they weren't allowing those. So we had to start with 3 bottles instead of 2. And then at one of the other aid stations, I had to take on 3 bottles instead of 2. So we had to jam bottles into jersey pockets, and we weren't allowed to throw bottles because of COVID. So there were just a few things that shifted this year that were different. And then they altered all the start times to spread everything out. So we had a 5:10 a.m. start time this year, which meant that we were going to be riding in the dark for about an hour and a half.
Wow.
Which had me a little nervous about riding in the dark for that long in a group of, we were going to have about 60 people in our start group.
Yeah, that would be nerve-wracking. I've never ridden with a group that big at night. Only small groups. How was the race different with teammates? Because it's interesting in the sense that you have those early climbs in the first 100 miles, and then you have the latter portion. Really, a team would really come into effect. So with 6 riders, did you pick the 6 riders because they would be good on the climbs, or what was your strategy there?
These were 6 guys who I think, if I'm remembering right, I'm the one who has ridden the least amount of Lotojas of any of them. 2 of them, I know this was their 10th Lotoja. And so being just my 3rd, I was definitely on the inexperienced side. So we had a kind of a team captain there. Who'd been keeping us all organized for months before. Planning strategy in the weeks leading up to it. And they were all guys I knew could climb. Fully expected all of them to be there over the top of that 3rd climb and ready to go. And on paper, we had probably the strongest team in that start group. And I felt like I was the weak link looking at our group. But we did end up losing one of them on the climbs. But we still had 5 of us over the lead climb, but it really made it so because we had so much strength, we didn't have to respond to everything. And we knew, there was a guy who kind of really tried pushing the pace on the very last climb, and we knew we could just let him go because no one else went with him. And we had all 5 of our remaining teammates were right there together, still kind of controlling things. Though our climb times were still really fast.
That's so after you get over those climbs, were you in a position, since you had a stronger team, of just kind of like policing things almost, just making sure nothing escaped? Or did you have an aggressive tactic where you were hoping to put in a decisive move?
We were mostly policing at this point. There were still a lot of strong riders left with us. And one of the guys who, that was his 10th Lotoja, he took control. 3 different times, I think the same guy tried to kind of solo break, and he immediately would organize the chase and without blowing anybody up, got the chase organized, brought everybody back together, did just what it took to make sure that we kept things organized and in control. And it was easy to understand those tactics because of things I had learned kind of through the podcast before, of how those race tactics work, and knowing like, oh yeah, we can let him go. We're fine because we've got the team right here.
Yeah.
And knowing we didn't have to respond to everything.
Coming in close to the finish, the previous year, you got a flat. This year,
Yeah.
Keep me posted on the events coming into the finish, because there were still events, were there not?
Still events. So with, I don't know the exact mileages, but somewhere around 15 miles to go, there is one last climb. And it's not long, couple minutes. And the same guy had kind of done a couple solo breaks earlier. He went again. And one of my teammates this time responded. And so I went with him. So the three of us kind of broke away, and we opened a gap on that final climb. And as we then kind of hit a descent flat spot, we realized that we weren't going to be able to stay away for 15 miles. So we cut it off pretty easy. And then you hit kind of a spot. Lotoja has been on a main highway for 180 miles at this point. And you kind of come off and you're just in this little side road for a while, and it's shady for the first time in 100 miles. And so everything just eased up. I think everybody knows that what's about to come at this point. There's not really any spots where you can make a break and have it stick. All the deciding points are out. So now we're all just kind of riding along in the shade, and we had the 3-4 group, and then they start the Cat 4s with us. So we had a few Cat 4 riders with us. And so now everybody's counting jerseys, trying to figure out who they've got to beat to end up on the podium. And I'm doing the math, kind of looking like, I think there's 9 of us in the 3-4s, and there were 5 or 6 of the 4s. And I was kind of back of the pack, and all of a sudden I heard a bunch of people's wheels start coming together, and we were just casually cruising, and I heard wheels coming together, clattering, and the guy right in front of me kind of bails out to the left and chopped my wheel and just dumped me. So I watched the whole group just sort of ride away as I'm kind of bouncing along the pavement here. And I bounced almost back to my feet, jumped up, grabbed my bike, realized the chain was off, got the chain back on, and started chasing. And I was a little nervous. I thought they're gone. And luckily, I kind of just dropped my elbows down onto the bars and TT'd. And it actually ended up, I was looking at the data, it looks like it was only about 2.5 minutes to catch on. So I caught back onto the group, and then I was just kind of gassed and sat on the back of the group for a little while. And so then you hit a bike path where it's super narrow, and you ride on this bike path for a while. And then you make a final turn with 6 miles to go. And then it's just a straight shot, almost dead flat for the final 6 miles.
Wow. And that's where it usually ends up opening up in a sprint. You mentioned something, friend of the podcast and actually personal friend of mine, Cameron Hoffman. He's won Lotoja plenty of times. Very good. He's a once pro racer, road racer, and still is absolutely in every sense a professional in terms of how he races. He's so darn good. That he this year actually won the race in the sprint. And so it always usually comes down to that. You've been training for these long distance events, right? But you've been doing it all with structured training, everything else. How'd the sprint finish shake down? And you actually mentioned that you actually hit some good power numbers too at the end of that 200-mile race, which is crazy.
Yeah. So Cameron had said, there's an online quote somewhere, I can't remember where I found it, but a couple of years ago, that Lotoja is a sprinter's race. And it's, all those big selection points happen early on, but then you got 100 miles of where it kind of favors the big guys who can just put power down. The climbers, have to be able to get over the top of those 3 climbs, but then in the end, those big guys are able to sprint for the win. And he had said that. I'd read it, and I kind of had always pigeonholed myself. Oh, I'm not a sprinter. I can't sprint. And listening to the podcast, and again, I know I've said that a few times, but that's where you guys have said over and over, don't, pigeonhole yourself. You guys are all amateurs. You don't know you're not a sprinter, those things. And so I spent this summer trying to work on sprinting. And after every long ride I did, if I'd go outside and I'd do a 4 or 5 hour ride, I tried to always sprint at the end of that and just see what I could muster up at the end of that long ride. And then I did a couple of specific just sprint workouts. I'd go out, I'd do that sprint, recover for 20 minutes, do a sprint, recover for 20 minutes. The week before Lotoja, I went out and did a ride where, I sprinted in between telephone poles here and there and just really paid attention to gearing. I remember listening to Justin Williams when he was interviewed talking about how he doesn't shift gears in the sprint. And that was sort of eye-opening to me. I think I've always ended up trying to go for another gear or whatever. And so I realized I needed to be in the right gear and just really wind it up and work on that pedal speed rather than trying to shift gears to keep the power coming. And so that was something I worked out. So I went out and tried to make sure I was at about the same starting speed of what I thought would happen in the final sprint and get that gearing right and know where that gear was. And so I just tried to do all those little things. And coming into it, then I just really, then there were a lot of games, everybody's looking, everybody's waiting, somebody'd kind of go hard and the field would respond. And over that last 6 miles, there are points where we're going slow and then we're going fast and we're going slow with everybody just looking at each other. And I got on the wheel of the guy who I thought I was going to win, who I thought was probably the biggest threat to win. And I just thought, I'm not coming off of this wheel. I'm going to stay right there. We're bumping elbows and did whatever I could to just try to surf wheels the best I could. And just what I thought was probably a little too early. Then a couple of the Cat 4 guys went, and I saw them go, and it broke the field up right there, and everybody started. And so at this point, I still kind of went seated, and I have a hard time with the distance, but I guess we were still 500 to 700 yards out at this point.
Oh, wow.
And so I just stayed seated, trying to make sure I was still on a wheel. And then as a gap finally opened and I couldn't quite hold the wheel in front of me, I stood and sprinted and finished 5th.
Wow. So, way to go.
I was super happy about that.
That's impressive. That's a tough field, a tough day, and then also to be able to sprint at the end of that. Do you know what you hit in terms of wattage at the end of that?
I hit 938 watts.
After such a long day, that's impressive.
So yeah, my peak normally I've gotten over 1100 here and there. I think all-time records like 1200. And so my goal is kind of if I could still manage 1,000 watts after the end of 9.5 hours on the bike, that I thought that was gonna be pretty good. And so at 938, I felt pretty good about that.
And this makes me want to race Lotoja. I'll put together a team here at TrainerRoad. That would be a ton of fun.
I definitely think you should. With Nate always talking about everything from Dirty Kansas and Cape Epic, and he likes those epic things. Leadville. I've always wondered how come he'd never done Lotoja.
Yeah, we could put together a good team too. We have some pretty big engines that, like you said, the sort of riders that can climb, but what they're really good at is putting in, big power over long periods of time. So that'd be a fun thing to do. Maybe we'll do that next year. That could be fun. Maybe next year might be tough.
Yeah.
We'll see. Yeah.
Love to see you there.
That would be a blast. Well, this has been awesome. It's been really fun to kind of go through your evolution with this event, kind of being the thing that ties it all together. Is there anything that you would say is kind of a final parting note to anybody listening to this that's either going to be racing Lotoja or just wants to take up structured training or prepping for any event? What would be the main helpful advice you would provide them?
Definitely fuel the workouts. We've heard that repeated a bunch of times. And then biggest thing for me was that consistency, when I just really started, foregoing group rides. Friends would give me the stink eye over that here and there. Or they say, "Oh, why don't you come ride?" I say, I've got this specific workout I've got to do. And when I stuck to all that, it seemed to pay off.
Awesome. Well, way to go. Will, this has been great. If folks want to get in touch with you, can they do so through the TrainerRoad forum, or what's the best way if they have any questions?
I am on TrainerRoad and on the forum. I'm not super active there. Strava, just Will Stinger, is probably the best way to find me. You can stalk me there, and
cool.
It's easy to find there.
And grab the man's wheel if you're going to ride Lotoja. So you'll have some wheel suckers next year holding on to you after listening to this. So way to go, Will. This has been super impressive. If you, like I mentioned, want to be on the podcast, then head over to trainerroad.com/podcast, and hopefully we can have a great interview like this. And also, if you want to get fast like Will, it's been clear what he said. Follow structure. So head over to trainerroad.com to do that. And thanks everybody for listening to this. Share it with your friends, help them get faster, and we'll talk to you all next week. Take care.
Thank you.